On my 70th birthday, my son looked across the dinner table and asked, "Mom, why did you lock my trust account?" I stopped cutting my birthday cake. The knife remained frozen in my hand while the candles flickered softly between us. Nobody spoke. Not my daughter-in-law Brenda. Not my grandson Tyler. Not even my son Michael seemed prepared for how heavy those words suddenly felt inside my dining room. Outside, snow drifted slowly across the dark Ohio street. Christmas lights from neighboring houses reflected faintly through the windows, painting soft colors across the walls Franklin and I had painted together nearly 30 years ago. But inside my house, the warmth disappeared instantly. I looked at Michael carefully. At 45, he still had his father's eyes. Blue. Earnest-looking. The kind of face people trusted automatically. Maybe that's why it took me so long to notice what he'd become. "I'm sorry," I asked quietly. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The trust account. I got a notification this morning saying access was restricted." Brenda immediately jumped in with a nervous laugh. "Oh my gosh, Michael, not tonight." But I noticed something important. She looked scared. Not confused. Not surprised. Scared. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from." Sometimes the people closest to us believe older women will never look closely enough at the truth. I slowly placed the cake knife onto the table. "What exactly were you doing in that trust account, Michael?" Silence. Tyler glanced nervously between his parents before lowering his eyes to his plate. The birthday dinner suddenly felt painfully quiet except for the soft jazz music playing from the kitchen speaker. Michael forced a smile. "Mom, don't make this weird. I was just trying to pay a few bills for you." "For me." "Interesting. Because until 3 weeks ago, I didn't even know the account still existed." I folded my napkin carefully into my lap. "You mean the account your father created before he died?" Michael's expression tightened slightly. "Yeah. The one you told me was nearly empty 4 years ago?" Another silence. Brenda reached for her wine glass too quickly, nearly knocking it over. That tiny movement told me more than words ever could. I looked down at my untouched birthday cake. 70 years old. When I was younger, I imagined reaching this age surrounded by honesty. Family dinners. Grandchildren laughing. A peaceful life built from decades of sacrifice. Instead, I was sitting across from my own son wondering how long he'd been lying to me. Franklin passed away 5 years earlier after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. In those final months, Michael handled almost everything financial. Hospital paperwork. Insurance forms. Bank meetings. At the time I was grateful. Grief makes trust feel easier. You become desperate for someone else to carry the weight. And Michael seemed so dependable back then. Or maybe I simply needed him to be. "Mom," Brenda said softly now, "Michael was only trying to help after your surgery." "My surgery?" "The hip replacement 2 years ago." Another convenient period where everyone insisted I rest, while they handled important decisions for me. I remembered sitting in this same dining room afterward while Brenda sorted through paperwork beside stacks of unopened mail. "You shouldn't stress yourself with finances, Evelyn," she'd said gently. "Michael will manage things." Manage. Funny word. People use it when they don't want to say control. I stood slowly from the table and walked toward the kitchen counter where my reading glasses rested beside an unopened envelope. The envelope had arrived 3 weeks ago from the trust administrator in Chicago. At first, I almost threw it away unopened. Then I noticed something strange. The account balance printed near the bottom corner. My hands trembled remembering that moment. Because according to Michael, the trust barely contained enough money to maintain my property taxes. But the balance I saw that afternoon was enormous. Large enough to change everything. Large enough to make me realize someone had been hiding the truth from me for years. I turned back toward the table. "Michael," I said quietly, "how much money did you transfer from that account last year?" His face went pale instantly. Brenda answered before he could. "That's an unfair question."
"No," he replied calmly.
An unfair question would be asking why I had to refinance my house at 68 while money sat untouched in my husband's trust. Tyler slowly looked up then. Confused. Concerned. Young enough to still believe adults tell the truth during family dinners. Michael pushed his chair back sharply. "Mom, You don't understand how complicated everything became after Dad died. There it was. Complicated. The favorite word of guilty people. I walked back toward the table slowly and picked up my phone. Then, without another word, I opened the banking app connected to the trust account. Michael's breathing visibly changed the moment he realized what I was looking at. Transfer history. Withdrawal records. Years of transactions. I scrolled silently while the room grew colder around us. Vacation payments. Luxury car deposits. Private school tuition. And then I saw the one transfer that made my stomach drop. 3 months earlier.
$42,000.
Transferred directly into an account under Brenda's name. I lifted my eyes slowly toward my daughter-in-law. And for the first time since this conversation began, she couldn't look back at me. Nobody moved after that. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked softly while snow tapped against the windows, but inside my dining room, the silence had become unbearable.
$42,000.
Transferred into Brenda's account. 3 months ago. I stared at the screen of my phone while my birthday candles slowly burned lower beside the untouched cake. Michael stood abruptly from his chair. Mom, let me explain. I looked up at him carefully. No, my voice surprised even me. Calm. Cold. For once, I think I'd rather hear the truth before the explanation. Brenda crossed her arms tightly. You're making assumptions based on transactions you don't understand. There it was again. That tone. Patient. Controlled. Slightly superior. The same tone she'd used for years whenever conversations became uncomfortable. As though I were an emotional old woman who simply couldn't keep up with modern finances. I had tolerated that voice for too long. Tyler looked back and forth between us nervously. At 16, he was old enough to understand tension but still young enough to believe families always recover from it. Dad? He asked quietly. Michael rubbed both hands over his face. It's complicated. I almost laughed. That word again. Complicated. When Franklin was alive, he hated vague language. He used to say honest people answer questions directly because they have nothing to hide. Dishonest people hide inside unnecessary explanations. I placed my phone carefully on the table. What exactly was Brenda doing with $40,000 from your father's trust? Michael hesitated too long. And that hesitation told me everything. Outside, wind rattled softly against the house. The old dining room windows trembled slightly, just like they always had during winter storms. Franklin used to promise he'd replace them one day. Now I wondered how many repairs I could have afforded if I'd known the truth sooner. Brenda finally spoke. It was temporary. Temporary. Interesting how stolen money always becomes temporary once discovered. For what? I asked. She straightened slightly in her chair. We had expenses.
Daher.
Expenses. Such a clean word for betrayal. Michael stepped forward quickly. Mom, after the market downturn and Tyler's school tuition, things got difficult. I blinked slowly. Difficult. My son was standing inside the house I nearly lost 2 years earlier because I couldn't afford the refinancing payments, telling me his private school expenses justified taking money from his dead father's trust. Something inside me shifted then. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a lock clicking shut. I suddenly remembered another conversation from years earlier. 3 months after Franklin's funeral, Michael had sat beside me in this exact dining room holding a stack of financial documents. I checked Dad's accounts, he'd said gently. There's less than we expected. At the time, grief made everything blurry. I remember apologizing for becoming a burden. God, the shame of that memory burned through me now. A burden. After 40 years of marriage. After helping Franklin build every piece of our life together. I had apologized for surviving him. Tyler pushed his plate away quietly. Dad, did Grandpa leave Grandma money? Nobody answered immediately. Then Michael sighed heavily. Yes. How much? Brenda immediately snapped. Tyler, this isn't your business. But the boy kept looking at his father. And for the first time that evening, I saw discomfort flicker across Michael's face in a way that looked genuine. Because children make lying harder. Especially when they still believe you're a good person. Enough, Michael muttered. Enough. Another vague answer. I stood slowly and walked toward the living room mantel. Franklin's photograph still sat beside the fireplace, smiling exactly the way he had during our anniversary trip to Vermont 15 years earlier. Steady, reliable, trustworthy. Everything suddenly felt painfully simple. Franklin trusted Michael. Michael trusted Brenda. And somewhere in that chain of trust, I disappeared. You know what hurts the most? I asked softly without turning around. Nobody answered. It's not the money. That part was true. Money matters when you're 70 years old and trying to survive alone. But betrayal cuts deeper than numbers ever can. I turned back toward them slowly. It's realizing none of you thought I'd ever find out. Brenda immediately shook her head. That's not fair. No. I tilted my head slightly. Then why did the transfer stop the moment I locked the account? Silence. Sharp silence. Tyler looked at his father again, confusion turning slowly into understanding. And suddenly Michael looked ashamed. Not defensive. Ashamed. He sat back down heavily at the table. Mom! His voice cracked slightly now. It wasn't supposed to become this. There it was. The closest thing to truth I'd heard all evening. Not supposed to become this. Because theft rarely begins dramatically. It begins quietly. One transfer. One excuse. One moment where someone convinces themselves they'll put everything back later. Then years pass. And greed settles in comfortably. I walked back toward the table and picked up my phone again. There's more, isn't there? Michael closed his eyes. Brenda immediately answered instead. You're overreacting. No. I realized then that I was finally reacting the correct amount. I scrolled further down the transfer history silently. Then I stopped. My pulse slowed. Not faster. Slower. The way it does right before terrible understanding arrives. A transfer from 6 months earlier. Property valuation services. Requested for Lakewood Cabin property. Franklin's cabin. The one place he made me promise never to sell. I lifted my eyes slowly toward Michael. And suddenly I understood this wasn't only about missing money anymore. The room suddenly felt smaller. Franklin's cabin. Just seeing the property valuation request sitting there in the transfer history made my chest tighten painfully. That cabin wasn't just real estate. It was our entire family history. Michael learned to fish there at 8 years old. Franklin taught Tyler how to skip stones across the lake the summer before he got sick. Every 4th of July, we sat on the dock wrapped in blankets watching fireworks reflect across the water. Franklin loved that place more than anywhere else in the world. And before he died, he made me promise something. Don't let anyone pressure you into selling it, Evelyn. At the time I thought he meant developers. I never imagined he meant our own family. I looked directly at my son. You were trying to sell the cabin. Michael froze. Brenda answered too quickly again. Nobody was trying to sell anything. I held up my phone silently. The transfer description remained glowing on the screen. Property valuation services. Lakewood Cabin property. Brenda's face tightened immediately. Caught. Tyler frowned from across the table. Dad. Michael sat back heavily in his chair and stared down at the table. That silence told me more than words ever could. Outside, snow continued drifting across the dark yard, while the birthday candles finally burned themselves out one by one. The room smelled faintly of vanilla frosting and cold coffee. A normal family birthday dinner. Destroyed in less than 20 minutes. When? I asked quietly. Michael rubbed his forehead slowly. Mom. When were you planning to sell it? Brenda leaned forward sharply. You're twisting everything. No, he replied calmly. I think I'm finally untwisting it. That shut her up. For years, Brenda always controlled conversations by making everyone else feel unreasonable. If you questioned her, she'd sigh heavily or accuse you of overreacting. I saw through it now. And once you see manipulation clearly, you can't unsee it again. Michael finally spoke. We were only discussing options. Options. Interesting word. Because people never call betrayal by its real name at first. They soften it, package it carefully, make it sound responsible. You told me the trust account barely survived Dad's medical bills, I said quietly. Michael swallowed hard. That's what we believed at the time. Another lie. Not even a good one. I walked toward the dining room window slowly. Snow covered the street in soft white layers while Christmas lights blinked peacefully on nearby houses. Everything outside looked calm. Meanwhile, my entire understanding of the past 5 years was collapsing behind me. I remembered the winter after Franklin died. The furnace failed during January. I called Michael crying because the repair estimate was almost $7,000. At the time, I'd barely been sleeping. Grief hollowed everything out inside me. Michael came over the next morning. I remember him standing right here in my kitchen saying, "Mom, maybe it's time to think about downsizing." Downsizing. Leaving the home Franklin and I built together. At the time, I thought he was worried about me. Now I wondered if he was already worried about protecting money he believed belonged to him. The realization made me feel physically ill. Tyler broke the silence carefully. Grandpa wanted Grandma to keep the cabin. Nobody answered him immediately. Then he added softly, "He told me that before he died." My eyes lifted sharply toward my grandson. "You remember that?" Tyler nodded slowly. "We were fishing." His voice became quieter. He said Grandma belonged there because it made her happy. The room went silent again. Brenda looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Because children remember inconvenient truths. Michael stared at his son with an expression I couldn't fully read. Shame. Maybe grief too. For a brief moment, I almost saw the boy I raised underneath the man sitting across from me. Then Brenda spoke again. "We were trying to secure Tyler's future." I turned slowly toward her. "With my husband's money? With family assets?" There it was. The entitlement underneath everything. Not help. Not confusion. Ownership. Brenda genuinely believed Franklin's trust belonged to them now. I walked back toward the table carefully and opened the transfer records again. The deeper I scrolled, the colder I became. Luxury hotel charges. Private investment transfers. Credit card payments. Then another property document appeared. Preliminary sale consultation. Estimated cabin market value. $1.8 million. My stomach dropped. Almost $2 million. No wonder they wanted it sold. Suddenly, every conversation from the past 3 years replayed differently in my mind. Brenda encouraging me not to travel anymore. Michael insisting cabin maintenance costs were too stressful for me. The constant pressure to simplify my life. Not because they cared about my comfort. Because they were waiting for me to become smaller, weaker, easier to control. I looked at Michael quietly. "Did you ever plan to tell me the cabin was still partially under my name?" His eyes widened slightly, and in that moment I knew the answer. He thought ownership transferred completely after Franklin died. That was why they panicked when I locked the trust account. Not because of the missing money, because they suddenly realized I still had legal power. Brenda stood abruptly from the table. "This is getting ridiculous." "No," I said softly. "I think it's finally becoming honest." She grabbed her purse angrily. Michael stood too, looking exhausted now. "Mom, can we talk privately tomorrow?" I stared at him for a long moment, then slowly shook my head. No more private conversations. His face fell immediately, because he understood exactly what I meant. Secrets survive in private. Truth doesn't need hiding anymore. Then my phone buzzed suddenly in my hand. A notification from the trust attorney's office. I opened the email silently, and the moment I read the subject line, my blood turned cold. Urgent. Unauthorized withdrawal investigation requested. The dining room went completely silent. Even Brenda stopped, reaching for her purse. I stared at the notification glowing on my phone screen while my heartbeat slowed into something cold and heavy. Urgent. Unauthorized withdrawal investigation requested. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Michael stepped toward me quickly. "Mom, let me see that." I pulled the phone back instinctively. No, the sharpness in my voice surprised all of us, especially me. Michael froze. Brenda's face had gone pale beneath the dining room lights now. Not irritated anymore. Afraid. Good. I opened the email carefully while everyone watched me. The message came from Harrison and Cole Financial Trust Services in Chicago, the firm Franklin hired years ago after selling part of his manufacturing business. I still remember the day we signed those trust papers. Franklin wore his Navy suit and joked that rich people paperwork gave him headaches. Back then we trusted our son completely. Funny how dangerous trust becomes once money enters a family. I read silently for several seconds. Then my stomach tightened. Mrs. Parker, during a routine audit review following recent account restriction activity, several transactions have been flagged for potential unauthorized misuse of protected trust funds. Please contact our office immediately. My fingers tightened around the phone. Routine audit. Meaning this wasn't only me discovering suspicious transfers anymore. Professionals saw it too. Michael looked sick suddenly. Mom! I lifted my eyes toward him slowly. How long did you think this would stay hidden? He opened his mouth, closed it again, because there was no answer. Brenda stepped forward carefully now, lowering her voice into that familiar calm tone she always used when trying to regain control. Evelyn, these companies overreact all the time. Audits happen constantly. Interesting. Not denial. Not shock. Experience. I noticed that immediately. You sound very familiar with financial investigations, I said quietly. Her jaw tightened. Tyler looked confused again. Mom, what's happening? Nobody answered him. Because how do you explain to a teenager that his parents may have stolen from his grandmother for years? I sat slowly back down at the table. My birthday cake remained untouched between us. 70 tiny silver decorations reflecting the dining room lights while the entire evening collapsed around it. For years, I imagined turning 70 surrounded by peace. Instead, I was discovering my husband spent his final months trying to protect me from my own family. The realization hurt in ways I couldn't fully describe. Michael finally spoke quietly. It wasn't supposed to get this far. There it was again. That sentence. As though betrayal simply wandered out of control accidentally. I looked directly at him. You keep saying that like this happened to you instead of because of you. That landed hard. I saw it in his face immediately. Brenda moved beside him protectively. We were under pressure after Franklin died. I almost laughed. Pressure. Another favorite word. Everyone always has reasons when they hurt older people. Bills. Stress. Children. Mortgage payments. But somehow those reasons never mattered when I struggled. I remembered sitting alone in this same dining room 2 winters earlier wrapped in blankets because my heating bill had doubled. I called Michael crying that night. Do you know what he said? Maybe it's time to think about assisted living, Mom. Assisted living. While nearly $2 million sat connected to trust assets my husband created to protect me. My chest ached remembering it now. Tyler suddenly stood up. Dad, did you steal Grandma's money? The question hit the room like shattered glass. Michael looked devastated instantly. Brenda reacted first. Tyler enough. But the boy kept staring at his father. And for the first time that evening, Michael couldn't hide behind complicated explanations anymore. He looked like a man seeing himself clearly for the first time. I never thought of it like that, he whispered. I closed my eyes briefly. That answer somehow hurt more than outright cruelty. Because it meant he slowly normalized my suffering until it no longer looked wrong to him. The email notification still glowed in my hand. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 years ago. Brenda insisting we move all trust statements to digital delivery, because paper mail was outdated. Michael encouraging me not to worry about passwords or account access. You deserve to relax now, Mom. Relax. Such a gentle word for exclusion. I opened the email attachment slowly. A spreadsheet appeared. Transaction summaries. Highlighted withdrawals. Flagged transfers. And then I saw something that made my pulse stop completely. Beneficiary modification inquiry submitted requested by Brenda Lawson Parker date. 8 months earlier. I stared at the line silently. Beneficiary modification. She wasn't only taking money. She had tried changing ownership structures too. Michael noticed my expression immediately. What? I turned the phone toward him without speaking. The moment he read it, all color drained from his face. Brenda went. Completely still beside him. Brenda! Michael's voice sounded hollow now. What is this? She swallowed hard. And for the first time since I'd known her, she looked cornered. Not polished. Not composed. Cornered. I can explain. But nobody at the table wanted explanations anymore. We wanted truth. And somehow, I had the terrible feeling this was only the beginning. Nobody moved after that. The spreadsheet remained glowing on my phone screen while the dining room slowly filled with the sound of Tyler crying quietly beside the Christmas tree. Beneficiary modification inquiry submitted. Requested by Brenda Lawson Parker. 8 months ago. The words replayed inside my head over and over again like something poisonous. Brenda wasn't just borrowing money. She had tried to change who inherited Franklin's trust. My trust. My husband's final protection for me. And suddenly every strange conversation from the last few years took on a darker meaning. Brenda encouraging me to simplify paperwork. Michael suggesting power of attorney just in case. The subtle pressure to move closer to them. To rely on them more. To become smaller. Easier. Controlled. Michael stared at his wife in disbelief. You told me the trust couldn't be changed. Brenda's breathing had become uneven now. Fast. Shallow. It was only an inquiry. Why? He demanded. She looked cornered for the first time since walking into my house that evening. Not elegant. Not composed. Just frightened. We needed security, she whispered. Security. Interesting word for theft. I slowly placed my phone on the table beside the untouched birthday cake. For who? Brenda looked toward me sharply. You have no idea what pressure we've been under. There it was again. Pressure. Everyone always has a reason when they betray old people. I folded my hands carefully together. Did pressure force you to hide account statements too? Silence. Michael looked at her immediately. What? I watched confusion slowly turn into horror on my son's face. Good. Maybe now he would finally understand how deep this really went. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway cabinet where I kept old paperwork and photo albums. My knees ached slightly. Winter always made the arthritis worse, but tonight I barely noticed. I opened the drawer and pulled out a stack of unopened envelopes tied together with a ribbon. Trust correspondence. Returned mail. Wrong forwarding notices. For years, I assumed the financial company simply stopped mailing updates after Michael streamlined everything online. Now I knew better. I dropped the stack onto the dining room table. Michael picked up one envelope slowly, then another. Each stamped, delivery preference updated. Authorized by Brenda Lawson Parker. The room went dead quiet. Tyler stared openly at his mother now. You hid Grandma's mail? Brenda immediately snapped. I was organizing things. No, I said softly. You were isolating me from my own finances. Michael looked physically sick. And suddenly I realized something important. He knew about the money. But maybe he didn't know everything. Brenda had been operating quietly in ways even he failed to notice. Or chose not to notice. Sometimes guilt survives by looking away. Michael sat back down heavily in his chair. How much? He whispered. Brenda crossed her arms tightly. I don't know. That answer ended something inside him. I saw it happen. The final collapse of denial. How much? He repeated louder. She finally snapped. Oh my God, Michael, stop acting innocent. You spent it too. The words exploded across the room. Tyler flinched visibly. Michael looked like she had slapped him. And suddenly all the careful pretending disappeared. Years of resentment poured out of Brenda all at once. You loved using that money when it benefited you, she shouted. The cabin taxes, your business debt, Tyler's tuition. That was Dad's money. It was family money.
No, y interrupta quietly.
Both of them stopped immediately. I looked directly at Brenda. It was never yours. The silence afterward felt enormous. Outside, snow kept falling across the quiet neighborhood while inside my dining room, the truth finally stood naked between all of us. I thought about Franklin then. About his rough hands fixing the cabin dock every summer. About him sitting beside hospital windows during chemotherapy pretending not to be afraid. About the night before he died. He squeezed my hand weakly and whispered, "You'll be okay, Evie." At the time I thought he meant emotionally. Now I understood he had spent his final strength trying to protect me financially too. And someone had turned that love into opportunity. Tyler suddenly stood from the table. I can't do this. His voice cracked badly. He looked at me with tears filling his eyes.
I'm sorry, Grandma.
That nearly broke me. Because none of this belonged to him. Children always inherit damage they never created. Emily, my older granddaughter from Michael's first marriage, suddenly appeared in the dining room doorway. She must have arrived quietly during the argument, and judging by her expression, she heard enough. She looked directly at me. Grandpa called Richard Bennett before he died, didn't he? Every head turned toward her. My pulse slowed instantly. Richard Bennett, Franklin's attorney. The one person I hadn't spoken to yet. Emily stepped fully into the room now, snow still melting from her coat. Then she said something that made Brenda go completely pale. He warned Grandpa someone was trying to change the trust before the funeral even happened. The room froze. Even the wind outside seemed quieter somehow. Emily stood near the dining room doorway, snow melting slowly from the shoulders of her dark wool coat, while every person at the table stared at her in silence. Brenda looked genuinely terrified now. Not irritated. Not defensive. Terrified. Michael blinked at his daughter slowly. What are you talking about? Emily kept her eyes on Brenda. Grandpa met with Richard Bennett 2 weeks before he died. My pulse slowed instantly. Franklin suspected something before the end. Not after. Before. Brenda stepped forward sharply. Emily, stop. But Emily ignored her completely. I drove Grandpa to the attorney's office because Dad was out of town that day, she continued quietly. He told me not to mention it because he didn't want family fighting while he was still alive. Michael looked stunned. You never told me this. Emily's expression hardened slightly. Would you have listened? That landed harder than shouting. Michael sat down heavily again, looking suddenly older than 45. I stared at my granddaughter carefully. Emily had always been observant. Even as a child, she noticed tension other people ignored. Franklin used to joke that she inherited the dangerous family eyes. The eyes that saw too much. And now I realize she'd been carrying this secret alone for years. What exactly did your grandfather say? I asked softly. Emily hesitated. Then she reached into her purse and removed a folded piece of paper. I didn't know if I should keep this, she admitted quietly. But after tonight, she handed it to me carefully. It was a photocopy, an official legal memo. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it beneath the dining room light. Subject: Protective Restrictions, Parker Family Trust. Prepared by Richard Bennett, Attorney at Law. Below that sat Franklin's signature. And beneath it, one sentence highlighted in yellow. In the event of unauthorized trust modification attempts, all beneficiary restructuring requests must be permanently frozen pending direct review by Evelyn Parker. I stopped breathing for a second. Direct review by Evelyn Parker. Me. Not Michael. Not Brenda. Me. The room remained completely silent while understanding slowly spread across my chest like ice water. Franklin knew enough to protect me legally before he died. Which meant Brenda's beneficiary inquiry 8 months earlier wasn't the first attempt. It was simply the one that got caught. Michael read over my shoulder now. Then he looked at his wife with an expression I had never seen before. Fear. Real fear. How many times did you try changing things? He whispered. Brenda shook her head immediately. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Her composure finally cracked completely. All I ever did was protect this family. I almost laughed at the irony. People who destroy families always describe themselves as protectors. Emily crossed her arms tightly near the doorway. You isolated Grandma from her own money. Brenda snapped toward her. You have no idea what adulthood costs. No, Emily replied coldly. I just know Grandpa cried in Richard's parking lot after that meeting. The room went still again. My chest tightened painfully. Franklin cried? My husband almost never cried. Not when his business nearly failed in the 90s. Not during cancer treatments. Not even after painful surgeries. The image shattered something inside me. Michael looked horrified now. What? Emily's eyes filled slightly. He said he felt like strangers were slowly taking control of everything he built. I closed my eyes. God. He knew. Maybe not fully, but enough to die worried. And I missed it. Brenda grabbed the back of a chair tightly. That's not fair. No. Emily's voice sharpened for the first time. Then why did you keep trying to remove Grandma from decisions? Nobody answered her. Because there was no answer. I slowly sat back down at the table while the birthday candles finally extinguished themselves completely. Thin smoke curled into the air between us. The celebration was over now. Only truth remained. Michael rubbed both hands over his face heavily. How much is left in the trust? Brenda looked away immediately, and suddenly my stomach dropped. That reaction terrified me more than anything so far. How much? Michael repeated. Her silence stretched. Too long. Then finally, less than before. Less than before. My heart began pounding slowly. I picked up my phone again and reopened the account summaries carefully. For the first time all night, I looked beyond the transfers, beyond the withdrawal history, and directly at the remaining balance. Then the room tilted around me. The account was almost empty. Not completely, but close enough to make my blood run cold. Michael saw my face instantly. What? I turned the screen toward him without speaking. He stared at the balance, then at Brenda, and all the color drained from his face. You said there was still plenty left. Brenda's voice became smaller now. We were going to fix it. When? He whispered. No answer. Because there never would have been a right time. That's the thing about greed. It keeps moving the finish line. I looked around my dining room slowly. The cracked ceiling paint. The outdated furniture. The house I nearly refinanced because I believed Franklin left me struggling. Meanwhile, the trust he created for my protection had been quietly drained year after year. Emily walked over and placed one hand gently on my shoulder. And somehow that small gesture almost broke me more than the betrayal itself. Because after hours of lies, one honest act suddenly felt enormous. Then my phone buzzed again. Another email from Harrison and Cole Trust Services. Urgent notice. Emergency asset protection hearing scheduled Monday morning. Mandatory attendance requested for Evelyn Parker. I stared at the screen, then slowly lifted my eyes toward Brenda. And for the first time all evening, she looked like someone who finally understood she might lose everything. Monday morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Franklin sitting in Richard Bennett's office, frightened enough to prepare legal protections against his own family before he died. That image stayed with me. Worse than the missing money. Worse than the lies. Because it meant my husband spent his final days carrying fear I never noticed. I stood in my kitchen before sunrise holding a cup of untouched coffee, while snow drifted softly across the backyard. The house felt painfully quiet after the disaster of my birthday dinner. Michael left shortly after midnight. Brenda stormed out before him. Tyler cried. Emily stayed. She slept in the guest room downstairs because she said she didn't want me alone after everything. That simple kindness nearly broke me more than anything else. At 70 years old, you begin noticing who shows up quietly when life collapses. Not loudly. Not performatively. Quietly. Emily appeared in the kitchen wearing one of Franklin's old cabin sweatshirts she found folded in the laundry room years ago. You ready? She asked softly. No. But readiness stops mattering eventually. I nodded anyway. The emergency hearing took place at Harrison and Cole's downtown office building in Cleveland. Franklin always joked the place looked more like a museum than a financial firm. This morning it looked like judgment. Emily drove because my hand still shook slightly whenever I thought about the trust balance. Almost empty. The phrase haunted me. For years I believed widowhood naturally shrank my life. Now I understood someone had been shrinking it deliberately. The city streets looked colorless beneath the winter sky. Snow piled along sidewalks while people hurried toward office buildings carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Normal Monday morning. Meanwhile, my family was quietly imploding. Emily parked beside the building and looked toward me carefully before we got out. You don't owe anyone protection anymore, Grandma. That sentence settled heavily inside my chest. Because protecting everyone else had been my role for decades. Protect the children from stress. Protect Michael from disappointment. Protect Franklin from worry during treatment. Protect family peace at all costs. And somewhere during all that protecting, nobody protected me. The conference room upstairs smelled faintly of leather and expensive coffee. Large windows overlooked the frozen river, while several people sat waiting around a polished wooden table. Lawyers. Financial officers. Auditors.
Professionals.
Not family. Which somehow made me feel safer. Richard Bennett stood the moment I entered. His expression softened immediately. Evelyn. I hugged him tightly before I could stop myself. Franklin's oldest friend. The last remaining person in the room who loved my husband before money complicated everything. Michael arrived minutes later alone.
No, Brenda.
That told me plenty already. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept either. The moment he saw me, guilt filled his face immediately. But strangely, I no longer felt anger looking at him. Only sadness. Deep, exhausting sadness. The lead auditor introduced herself calmly and began reviewing documents projected onto a screen at the front of the room. Transfer histories. Account depletion charts. Unauthorized modification requests. The numbers looked even worse, professionally displayed. Nearly $600,000 missing over 5 years. Emily inhaled sharply beside me. I stopped breathing entirely. 600,000. My stomach twisted violently. Michael lowered his head into his hands. Oh my God. The auditor continued in a steady voice. Many withdrawals occurred after administrative authorization legally expired. Expired. That word mattered now. Because expired authority changes mistakes into misconduct. Richard leaned toward me quietly. Franklin's protections prevented full asset restructuring, meaning the cabin survived. Barely. The auditor changed slides again. Luxury purchases appeared itemized line by line.
Vehicles.
Vacations. Private investment losses. Then another category appeared. Debt recovery transfers. Michael lifted his head sharply. What debt? The auditor looked directly at him. Several withdrawals were used to stabilize failing business accounts connected to Parker Home Development. Michael's company. His face went white instantly. I didn't know where that money came from. I believed him. Oddly enough, I truly did. Not because he was innocent, but because weak people often avoid questions when answers might force them to act. Brenda always handled details. Michael simply benefited from them. And sometimes cowardice destroys lives almost as thoroughly as greed. Richard slid another document toward me quietly. A secondary trust amendment. Signed by Franklin 3 days before he died. My pulse slowed instantly. I opened it carefully. Then my eyes widened. In the event of confirmed financial misconduct involving trust assets, sole control of all remaining holdings, including Lakewood Cabin property, transfers permanently to Evelyn Parker effective immediately. Below that sat Franklin's signature. And Richard's. The room blurred slightly around me. Franklin knew. Not fully perhaps. But enough. Enough to prepare for betrayal before he even left this world. Michael stared at the document in shock. Then whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. Dad knew we'd fail him. No. I looked at my son carefully then. Franklin knew someone would. And somehow that hurt even more. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Michael said it. The conference room suddenly felt too quiet. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted slowly across downtown Cleveland, while traffic crawled beneath the gray morning sky. Somewhere far below us, a siren echoed faintly through the streets. Normal life continued. Meanwhile, mine had split open completely. I stared at Franklin's final trust amendment lying in front of me. Sole control transfers permanently to Evelyn Parker. Even dying, my husband was still trying to pull me back towards safety. The realization hurt almost unbearably. Richard adjusted his glasses quietly beside me. Franklin changed the amendment 48 hours after discovering the first irregular transfers. Michael looked up sharply. First transfers. The lead auditor nodded once. There were multiple small withdrawals initially. They appeared structured to avoid triggering mandatory review. Structured. Careful. Planned. Not accidental. I closed my eyes briefly. Brenda hadn't simply panicked financially. She built a system. One slow enough to stay invisible. Emily folded her arms tightly beside me. She knew exactly what she was doing. Nobody disagreed. The auditor changed slides again. This time dates appeared beside transfer amounts. And suddenly my stomach dropped. I recognized one immediately. October 14th. 5 years ago. The day Franklin entered hospice care. I remembered sitting beside his hospital bed holding his hand while machines beeped softly around us. That same afternoon, $25,000 disappeared from the trust. I physically recoiled. Michael noticed. What? I pointed silently at the screen. His face collapsed the moment he saw the date. Oh God. The auditor continued speaking in a professional monotone, but her voice sounded far away now, because suddenly memories began rearranging themselves differently inside my head. Brenda offering to handle paperwork, while I stayed with Franklin. Brenda constantly volunteering to visit the bank. Brenda insisting I focus only on my husband while she managed stressful details. At the time I thought she was helping me survive grief. Now I realize she was hiding inside it. Michael rubbed both hands over his face hard. I didn't know she took money while Dad was dying. The room remained silent. Then Richard spoke carefully. Michael, whether you knew specific dates or not, you still benefited from those withdrawals. That landed heavily, because it was true. Michael may not have orchestrated everything, but he lived comfortably while his mother quietly struggled. And some betrayals happen through silence just as much as action. The auditor changed slides again. Remaining trust balance. $43,118. I stared at the number. $43,000. That was all. After Franklin spent 40 years building his business, after decades of overtime shifts, canceled vacations, and sleepless nights worrying about investments, that was what remained. I suddenly remembered Franklin standing in our garage 20 years earlier repairing old equipment himself because he hated wasting money. Every dollar matters eventually, Evie, he used to say. He built that trust from sacrifice. And someone consumed it piece by piece like it meant nothing. Michael looked sick. She told me the trust was stable. Richard's expression hardened slightly. She also attempted beneficiary restructuring twice. Twice. Michael stared at him in disbelief. What? Richard opened another folder slowly. 2 denied requests. Both submitted electronically under Brenda's credentials. Both requesting expanded trustee authority. One included partial transfer language involving Lakewood cabin property. My pulse slowed instantly. The cabin again. Always the cabin. Franklin protected it separately for a reason. Because somewhere deep down, he knew greed eventually reaches for the most sentimental thing first. Emily looked furious now. She was trying to take everything. Michael whispered softly. No, but nobody corrected her. Because the evidence already had. The lead auditor folded her hands together. There's another issue we need to discuss. Something about her tone made my stomach tighten immediately. Richard looked uneasy too. What issue? I asked quietly. The auditor glanced toward several printed documents before answering. 3 months ago, a reverse mortgage inquiry was submitted against Mrs. Parker's primary residence. The room tilted slightly around me. My house. My home. Michael looked stunned. What? The auditor continued calmly. The inquiry was denied because ownership documentation remained incomplete. I couldn't breathe for a second. Brenda tried to put debt against my house. The same house Michael once suggested I sell because finances were too stressful. Emily muttered softly under her breath. Oh my God. Richard leaned toward me immediately. Evelyn, did you ever authorize mortgage discussions? No, my own voice sounded distant now. Thin. Cold. The auditor nodded slowly. That's why the request triggered review flags internally. Flags. Warnings. Professionals noticed danger around me before I did. That realization humiliated me more than anything else. At 70 years old, I thought experience made people harder to fool. Instead, grief made me vulnerable in ways I never expected. Michael suddenly stood from his chair. I need to talk to Brenda. His voice shook now. Not angry. Destroyed. Richard looked at him carefully. You need to prepare yourself first. Michael frowned. For what? Nobody answered immediately. Then the auditor slid one final document across the table. An active forensic review request. Initiated 48 hours earlier. Reason. Suspected elder financial exploitation. The words seemed to echo through the room. Elder financial exploitation. Not misunderstanding. Not family conflict.
Exploitation.
I stared at the page silently while snow continued falling outside the conference room windows. And for the first time since Franklin died, I realized this wasn't only about betrayal anymore. It was about consequences. Michael left the conference room without another word. The heavy glass door closed behind him softly, but the silence he left behind felt enormous. I remained seated at the long polished table staring at the forensic review paperwork, while snow drifted beyond the windows. The words elder financial exploitation still echoed painfully in my head.
Exploitation.
Such a cold professional word for what betrayal actually feels like. Richard sat beside me quietly. "Evelyn," he said gently, "you don't need to make decisions today." But I already knew something important. Decisions had been made around me for years. Without me. That was over now. Emily poured me a cup of coffee from the silver tray near the conference room wall. Her hands shook slightly while she set it down beside me. "You okay?" "No." But strangely, I no longer felt confused. That mattered. The lead auditor continued reviewing documents calmly, while another attorney entered carrying additional folders. More paperwork. More numbers. More proof that grief had blinded me to things happening directly in front of my face. The attorney introduced herself as Laura Simmons from Harrison and Cole's legal division. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten immediately. "Mrs. Parker, there's evidence several transfers may have violated federal elder protection statutes." Statutes? Federal. The language suddenly became frighteningly serious. Richard leaned forward slightly. "How extensive?" Laura opened a folder. "Preliminary estimates suggest approximately $640,000 in questionable distributions over 5 years. 640,000. The number physically hurt. I remembered Franklin working 60-hour weeks during the early years of his business, missing vacations, repairing machinery himself because hiring extra workers cost too much. He built that money carefully, patiently, and someone treated it like an emergency credit card. Emily looked furious now. She spent Grandma's future. Nobody corrected her, because that was exactly what happened. Laura continued carefully. "We also discovered attempted property leverage against Mrs. Parker's residence and informal sale inquiries involving Lakewood cabin property. The cabin again. Always the cabin. Franklin protected it because he knew what it represented. Not wealth. Memory. And greedy people always underestimate how powerful memory becomes once everything else disappears." My phone buzzed quietly on the table. "Michael." I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Mom." His voice sounded broken. Not emotional manipulation. Real collapse. "I found Brenda." Something about his tone made my chest tighten immediately. "Where are you?" "At the house." "Not our family house. Their house." I could hear muffled shouting in the background. Then Brenda's voice suddenly exploded through the phone. "You let them turn you against me." Michael shouted something back I couldn't fully hear. Then silence again. I closed my eyes briefly. 5 years ago I would have rushed to fix this. Calm everyone down. Protect family peace. But peace built on lies eventually rots from underneath. "Mom," Michael whispered. "There's more." Of course there was. "There are credit cards." My pulse slowed. "What kind of credit cards?" "Under the trust." The room around me suddenly felt cold again. Laura and Richard exchanged looks immediately beside me. They could hear enough from my side of the conversation to understand. "How much?" I asked quietly. Michael didn't answer immediately. Then finally, "About 90,000. Emily covered her mouth sharply beside me.
$92,000.
Additional debt. Hidden debt. Attached to Franklin's trust. I suddenly remembered Brenda buying designer handbags during a period when she claimed Michael's business was barely surviving. At the time I assumed appearances were deceptive. Now I realized they were funded. My stomach twisted painfully. "What else?" I asked. Michael sounded like he might be crying now. "She opened a line of credit against the cabin appraisal." The room froze. Richard immediately reached for a notepad. Laura's expression hardened. "How?" I whispered. "She used projected sale documents," Michael said weakly. "She thought once the property transferred officially, nobody would notice." Nobody would notice. That sentence settled inside me like poison, because it revealed the ugliest truth of all. Brenda believed I would die before discovering any of this, or become too weak to stop it. I stared out the conference room windows toward the frozen river below. At 70 years old, people begin treating you differently. More fragile. More forgettable. More temporary. And some people mistake aging for helplessness. Michael spoke again quietly. She packed bags. I frowned slightly. What? She's leaving. Silence spread slowly through the conference room. Then Emily muttered softly. Coward. But strangely, I didn't feel anger hearing it. Only exhaustion. Years of manipulation. Years of hiding. Years of pretending. And now when truth finally surfaced, Brenda ran. Laura folded her hands together professionally. Mrs. Parker, we strongly recommend immediate asset freeze protections. Richard nodded once. I agree. I looked down at Franklin's trust amendment again. His signature. Steady despite the illness already consuming him. Even dying, he still fought for me. That realization gave me strength I didn't expect. I picked up my coffee slowly, then looked toward Laura. What happens now? She answered carefully. Now we begin recovering what's left. Recovering. Such a strange word. Because money wasn't the only thing stolen from me. Trust was too. And I had the terrible feeling that would be much harder to recover. Brenda disappeared before sunset. Michael called me from their driveway just after 5 o'clock, his voice hollow and exhausted. She's gone. Outside my kitchen window, snow drifted softly across the backyard while darkness settled over the neighborhood. Emily sat quietly at the dining room table beside me sorting through trust paperwork Richard had sent home earlier that afternoon. I closed my eyes briefly. Gone. After 5 years of draining Franklin's trust. After trying to leverage my house. After nearly selling the cabin. She left. What do you mean gone? I asked quietly. The closet's half empty. Michael sounded numb. She took luggage. I could hear him walking through the house while drawers opened and slammed somewhere in the background. Then his voice changed. Smaller. Oh my God. My chest tightened immediately. What? No answer at first. Then, she took the hard drives. Emily looked up sharply across the table. What hard drives? I asked carefully. The financial backups, Michael whispered. Business records. Trust documents. Everything. Richard had warned us about this possibility during the meeting. People who panic financially often panic digitally too. Erase records. Hide transfers. Destroy timelines. But somehow hearing it happen for real still made me feel sick. Michael exhaled shakily into the phone. I didn't know any of this was this bad. I stared down at Franklin's trust amendment resting beside my coffee cup. For years, my son benefited from money he never questioned deeply enough. And now he sounded shocked by what that blindness cost. I felt sorry for him. That was the hardest part. Even after everything, I still felt sorry for him. Where's Tyler? I asked softly. At Emily's apartment. Good. At least one child in this family still understood protection. Michael's breathing became uneven. Mom, I think she was planning this for a while. I looked toward the stack of property documents spread across my dining room table. The cabin appraisals, mortgage inquiries, beneficiary modification requests. No, this didn't happen suddenly. It was built slowly, quietly, like mold spreading behind walls until the structure finally collapses. What are you going to do? I asked. Michael laughed once bitterly. I don't even know who my wife is anymore. That sentence stayed with me after we hung up. Because betrayal always creates two griefs. The grief of what happened, and the grief of realizing the person beside you may never have been who you believed. Emily stood and walked toward the kitchen window quietly. She won't get far. I looked at her carefully. You sound very certain. She only understands control, Emily replied softly. People like that always come back when they lose it. Smart girl. Too smart sometimes. I slowly gathered the papers into neat stacks while the house creaked softly around us. The heating vents hummed through the old walls Franklin once promised to renovate after retirement. Retirement. We barely got 2 years before cancer stole it from him. The ache of missing my husband hit suddenly and hard then. Not because I needed someone to rescue me. Because he should have spent his final years fishing at the cabin instead of preparing legal protections against his own family. Emily touched my shoulder gently. You okay? I nodded automatically, but she knew better. Grandpa trusted you, she said quietly. That almost broke me, because I suddenly realized something painful. Franklin never failed me. Even dying, he saw danger coming and fought against it. The people who failed me were still alive. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I stared at it for a moment before answering. Silence greeted me first. Then Brenda's voice. Alice. She sounded calm again. Controlled. Like she'd spent the last few hours rebuilding herself emotionally. I think we should talk privately. There it was. The same pattern again. Isolation. Control. Secrets. Noah pause. You don't understand what Michael's business problems were really like. Interesting. Even now she framed theft as necessity. I leaned back slowly in my chair. You tried putting debt against my home. Silence. Then carefully. That house would have stayed in the family. I closed my eyes. The entitlement in that sentence chilled me. As though my home belonged to family strategy instead of my actual life. You stole from Franklin. Her voice hardened instantly. I took care of him while you fell apart. There it was. The resentment underneath everything. Not greed alone. Scorekeeping. Brenda believed caregiving earned ownership. That surviving difficult seasons made her entitled to what Franklin built. You know what your problem is, Alice? She continued coldly. You still think love and money are separate things. I looked toward Franklin's photograph above the fireplace. No, I said quietly. I think you stopped understanding love entirely. Silence exploded between us. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. He knew more than you think. I sat upright immediately. What does that mean? But the line disconnected. Emily looked at me sharply. What happened? I stared slowly at the dark phone screen in my hand, then at Franklin's trust amendment. And suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare began, I wondered if my husband had discovered something even worse before he died. I didn't sleep after Brenda's phone call. The house felt wrong somehow. Too quiet. Too hollow. Every creak in the hallway made me think about Franklin walking through the darkness during those final months, carrying fears he never fully shared with me. He knew more than you think. Her words replayed endlessly inside my head. At 2 a.m, I finally gave up trying to sleep and walked downstairs wrapped in Franklin's old wool robe. Snow covered the backyard completely now, glowing pale beneath the porch light. The dining room table remained buried beneath trust documents and financial reports. Evidence. Proof. The remains of a family collapsing under the weight of greed. I sat slowly in Franklin's chair at the head of the table and stared at his photograph near the fireplace. What did you know? I whispered. Of course no answer came. But suddenly another memory surfaced. 3 weeks before Franklin died. I had gone home briefly from the hospice center to shower and rest. When I returned later that evening, I found Franklin awake and strangely agitated. Michael and Brenda had just left. I remember asking if everything was okay. Franklin hesitated before answering. Evie, if anything ever feels wrong after I'm gone, promise me you'll ask Richard for help. At the time I thought he was confused from medication. God, the guilt nearly crushed me now. He wasn't confused. He was warning me. My phone buzzed softly on the table. Richard Bennett. I answered immediately. Evelyn, he said quietly, I think you should come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. Something in his voice tightened my chest instantly. What happened? A pause. Then carefully. I found additional files Franklin left sealed. The room around me seemed to stop moving. Additional files? Yes. I gripped the phone harder. What kind of files? Another hesitation. The kind that suggests Franklin discovered the trust withdrawals before hospice care began. I closed my eyes. No. No. That meant my husband spent his final months not only dying, but watching someone betray him financially too. I'll be there, I whispered. The drive downtown the next morning felt unreal. Gray skies stretched across Cleveland while dirty snow piled along the roadsides. Emily insisted on driving again after seeing my face when I came downstairs. You look pale, she said softly. I didn't tell her I spent half the night crying quietly in Franklin's robe. At 70 years old, grief changes shape. It becomes quieter, heavier, less dramatic, but no less painful. Richard met us personally in the lobby again. This time he looked deeply unsettled. That frightened me immediately. Inside his office, several old file boxes sat stacked beside his desk. Franklin's handwriting covered the labels. Personal. Trust. Do not discard. My knees weakened slightly. Richard guided me carefully into a chair before speaking. Franklin started documenting concerns almost 6 months before he died. Emily inhaled sharply beside me. I stared at the boxes silently. 6 months. That long. Richard opened one folder slowly and slid several printed emails across the desk toward me. I recognized Brenda's email address immediately. So did Emily. The first message made my stomach turn. Frank is getting weaker. He signs whatever Michael puts in front of him now. My hands began trembling. Another email. Once Evelyn stops paying attention to finances, everything will be easier to manage. I physically recoiled. Not because of the money anymore. Because they discussed us like obstacles. Problems to manage. Franklin. Me. Our entire life together reduced into administrative inconvenience. Emily looked horrified. Oh my God. Richard removed another document quietly. Then another. Bank notifications Franklin printed himself. Unauthorized transfer alerts. Beneficiary inquiries. He knew. My husband knew. Tears blurred my vision completely now. I thought the medication confused him. I whispered brokenly. Richard's face softened immediately. No, Evelyn. Franklin was trying to protect you while protecting the family at the same time. That sentence shattered me. 'Cause it sounded exactly like Franklin. Even betrayed, he still tried preserving everyone else. Emily picked up another paper slowly. Then her expression changed. Grandma. I looked up. She handed me the document carefully. It was a handwritten note from Franklin. Short. Only 3 sentences. If Michael discovers the truth before I'm gone, he'll choose Brenda over me. If Evelyn discovers it afterward, she'll blame herself. God help this family when the truth finally surfaces. I covered my mouth instantly. The room disappeared around me. 'Cause somehow, Franklin predicted all of it. Every piece. The shame. The silence. The collapse. Richard sat down heavily across from me. There's one more thing. Of course there was. There always is, I whispered. Richard nodded sadly. Then he opened the final folder. Inside sat copies of life insurance amendments Franklin attempted to file 3 days before he died. Attempted. Not completed. I frowned through tears. What happened? Richard looked directly at me. The paperwork was never submitted. Cold spread slowly through my chest. Why not? Richard hesitated, then quietly answered. Because someone canceled the final appointment with the insurance office the morning Franklin died. Nobody spoke after Richard said that. The office felt completely still. Outside the windows, snow drifted slowly across downtown Cleveland, while morning traffic moved beneath gray skies. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang softly through the cold air. I stared at the unfinished insurance paperwork in front of me. 3 days before Franklin died. 3 days. That meant while I sat beside his hospice bed holding his hand, someone was quietly interfering with the final protections he tried leaving behind for me. My chest hurt so badly I could barely breathe. Emily moved closer immediately. Grandma. I shook my head slowly. Not because I was angry anymore. Because I suddenly understood how lonely Franklin must have felt near the end. Sick. Weak. Suspicious. And trapped between protecting his wife and preserving what remained of his family. Richard slid another paper across the desk carefully. Phone records. Cancelled appointment confirmation. Requested by Brenda Lawson Parker. I closed my eyes. There it was. Final proof. Not confusion. Not financial stress. Not mistakes. Choice. Brenda made choices over and over again. And each one moved a little closer toward taking control of everything Franklin built. Emily looked furious beside me. She did this while he was dying. Nobody corrected her. Because the evidence already had. I sat there silently for a long moment while grief settled over me in waves. Not only grief for the money, or even the betrayal. Grief for Franklin. Because now I knew the truth. My husband died afraid. Afraid for me. Afraid of what would happen after he was gone. And somehow that hurt more than everything else combined. Richard removed his glasses slowly. There's something important you need to understand, Evelyn. I looked up. Franklin never stopped fighting for you. Tears filled my eyes immediately. Richard continued quietly. The trust amendments. The cabin protections. The insurance revisions. He kept trying to create barriers faster than they could work around them. Barriers. Protections. My husband spent his final strength building walls around me, while I thought we were simply planning for widowhood. I covered my mouth briefly. God, how did I miss all of it? Emily squeezed my hand gently. This isn't your fault. Maybe not. But trust still leaves bruises when it breaks. Richard leaned back heavily in his chair. The forensic team officially froze all remaining trust assets this morning. I nodded slowly. How much survived? He checked the report beside him. Between the protected cabin ownership and remaining liquid accounts, approximately $800,000. My eyes widened slightly, not because it was enormous wealth, because I truly believed almost everything was gone. Richard gave a small tired smile. Franklin protected more than Brenda realized. Of course he did. That sounded exactly like my husband. Quiet, careful, always planning 3 steps ahead. Emily exhaled shakily beside me. What happens now? Richard's expression softened. That depends on Evelyn. The room fell quiet again. For days everyone asked what Brenda did, what Michael knew, what money disappeared. But suddenly I realized the more important question was different. What kind of life did I want now? At 70 years old, people assume your future has already narrowed, that your biggest stories are behind you. But sitting there in Richard Bennett's office, I realized something surprising. I still had choices left. I looked down at Franklin's handwritten note one final time. God help this family when the truth finally surfaces. The truth had surfaced now. And strangely, the world didn't end. Pain came. Consequences came. But clarity came too. Michael called while we were still sitting there. I answered quietly. Mom. His voice sounded exhausted. Broken. I asked Brenda for a divorce. I closed my eyes slowly. Not satisfaction. Just sadness. Deep sadness. Because once betrayal reaches a certain point, there are no winners left. I'm sorry, he whispered. And this time I believed him. Not because apologies repair damage, but because guilt finally reached him honestly. I looked out the office window at the snow-covered city below. Your father loved you very much, I said softly. Michael started crying then. The kind of crying grown men do only when something inside them finally collapses completely. I failed him. No. Franklin already understood something important before he died. Weakness and cruelty are not always the same thing. Michael wasn't cruel the way Brenda was. He was weak, passive, comfortable looking away. And sometimes that destroys families just as thoroughly. After we hung up, Richard quietly handed me a small brass key. I frowned slightly. The cabin. He nodded. Franklin asked me to give it to you personally once everything's settled. The old lake cabin key rested cold and heavy in my palm. Suddenly I could almost smell pine trees and lake water again. Hear Franklin laughing from the dock. See Tyler catching fireflies beside Emily when they were children. Memory survived. That mattered. I stood slowly from the chair. At 70 years old, my knees hurt more than they used to. Grief still lived permanently beneath my ribs. And my family would never look the same again. But as I closed my fingers around the cabin key, I no longer felt helpless. Just older. Wiser. Awake. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Cleveland, while life moved forward around all of us. And for the first time since Franklin died, I finally believed I would too.